In 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt sent the U.S. Navy on a mission to circumnavigate the world and show off just how powerful the country was. This had become a common practice amongst the nations of Europe, especially during the birthdays of monarchs. Teddy Roosevelt, both a progressive and a nationalist, wanted to be like the great empires of Europe. A German fleet had visited New York a few years earlier, and the Europeans did this all the time with each other. President Roosevelt had been pushing Congress to increase spending on the Navy, so this was the opportunity to show off. Now, this is the story that's usually told about the Great White Fleet. You know, it's just Teddy waving his big stick around in order to show off how strong America was. But what if I told you that this whole event wasn't about America showing off to Europe how strong it was, but showing off to a non-European power? The Great White Fleet, although serving multiple purposes, was mostly about US-Japanese relations. That's the story I'm going to tell you today. So the context of the Great White Fleet is that it happens in sort of the lead up to World War I. And with this video's sponsor, World of Warships, you too can reenact turn of the century naval warfare. World of Warships is a free-to-play game available on PC, where you can take command of warships from World Wars I and II and engage in naval battles, allowing you to place real historical ships in combat scenarios they never got to experience. You can even take control of some of the ships from the Great White Fleet, such as the USS Minnesota, Kansas, and Vermont. The game also functions like a digital museum, displaying these breathtaking recreations of the most fearsome ships of the 20th century. But they also include ships that were planned but never built, giving you an amazing range of gameplay possibilities. And they are releasing new content every month in the form of new ships, cosmetics, and even nations you can play as. It has over 40 unique maps with dynamic weather and some brilliant new water effects. You'll have access to battleships, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and aircraft carriers to let you take command of both the tides and the skies. And if you get really into the game, they have an active community with a dedicated Discord server, live streams, and tournaments. And if you're not a PC person, that's fine, because World of Warships is also available on Xbox and PlayStation. And as I said earlier, all of this is free. You can get it by clicking the top link down in the description, and by using the promo code WARSHIPS, you can get a bunch of free doubloons, account credit, free premium time, and a free ship after 15 battles. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. Now, the story of Japan's modernization has been told numerous times on YouTube, and so I will give you just a brief refresher. For several centuries, Japan maintained a policy of isolationism, restricting access to the country by foreigners. But over the course of the 19th century, the European powers, and eventually the United States, began searching for markets to sell their goods in, as well as for warships to resupply as they protect their nations, colonies, and trade routes. But in the 1850s, foreign powers began to forcibly open up Japan to the outside world, starting with the US, with most European countries following after. After a period of civil war and unrest, the regime of the Tokugawa shogunate was dismantled and replaced with an imperial government centered around Emperor Meiji in his capital in Tokyo. The Meiji government, wanting to avoid the fate of China, which had been ravaged by the Opium Wars and was beginning to be carved up by the Europeans into spheres of influence, embarked on a campaign of modernization, introducing a British-style parliamentary government and a German-style military. They also embraced industrialization, which eventually allowed them to manufacture their own modern arms and navies. As they industrialized, they not only needed markets to sell goods, but a supply of raw materials to produce said goods, and so they began to assert influence in China and Korea. The European powers, operating under an assumption of Oriental racial inferiority, would actively squash Japan's attempts to rise to the level of a great power. The United States was also a rising power at this time, and they too were looking to Europe for role models. Progressives looked to the domestic policies of Europe for examples of government welfare programs and social control, while the nationalists looked at European militaries and empires. Theodore Roosevelt was both, having made his name in politics by volunteering for a war and implementing progressive reforms in New York, became president upon the death of William McKinley in 1901, and would begin pushing for his reforms at a national level. Roosevelt was a disciple of Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, would become a textbook in naval colleges across the globe. His thesis emphasized the importance of naval supremacy on global power, and Roosevelt would take it to heart. He supported revolutionaries in Panama seeking independence from Colombia in order to build a canal that would allow for the U.S. Navy to become a bi-ocean fleet. TR is often given credit for fostering the modern U.S. Navy, but in reality, the U.S. Congress had been regularly increasing the budget of the U.S. Navy since the 1880s, and TR simply harnessed a trend already in action. As American trade expanded around the world, there was a greater demand for protection from the Navy, which required more ships. On top of more ships, the US would need more ports and bases that they could station these ships at. The Spanish-American War provided an excellent opportunity to meet these needs. Not only did the US drive the Spanish out of Cuba, they also obtained several bases in the Pacific, such as in the Philippines and Guam. This brought the US into more direct confrontation with the Japanese. Tension was also growing with Russia. Although the US had fairly good relations with the Tsars, there was a growing public outrage toward Russia's treatment of Jews. Theodore Roosevelt was a man of his age and possessed many of the anti-Semitic presumptions most Anglo-Saxons had. But he was also anti-Slavic, and saw the world through the context of the Great Game, a competition to civilize the world between the Slavic powers, led by Russia, and the Anglo-Saxons, led by Britain, and Teddy wanted to insert American leadership into this struggle. No human beings, black, yellow, or white, could be quite as untruthful, as insincere, and arrogant, in short, as untrustworthy in every way, as the Russians. Both America and Britain saw Japan as being a valuable asset in their fight against Russia. And in relation to this, Albert J. Beveridge said, "There is but one agency which might dislodge the Russians from Manchuria, the sword-like bayonets of the soldiers of Japan, the warships of Japan, the siege guns of Japan." The British would beat America to the punch on utilizing Japan against Russia when they signed the Anglo-Japanese Treaty in 1902. It dedicated both parties to the open door policy in China, as well as recognizing Japan's interests in Korea. It also created a defensive alliance, in which if either Britain or Japan became involved in a war in China or Korea against more than one power, then the other would join them. Basically, if there was a one-on-one fight, they would each be on their own. But if one of them ended up fighting a two-on-one fight, the other would come to their defense. This was especially important for Japan due to having their victory in the First Sino-Japanese War stolen from them by the triple intervention of France, Germany, and Russia. If the powers of Europe tried to do that again, they would also be at war with Britain, who had naval supremacy at the time. Early in his presidency, Roosevelt had thought about forming a military alliance with either Britain or Japan, but the isolationist tendencies of the American public and policymakers made this politically impossible. The treaty also threatened to bring the US and Britain to war against each other if the US decided to challenge Japan's goals in Northwest Asia. Despite all of this, TR saw Japan as useful in the clash of civilizations between the Anglo-Saxons and the Slavs. He saw the Japanese as a rising race that was transitioning from being barbarous to civilized, and saw their influence as preferable to that of Russia, and thus supported Japan's territorial aims in Korea. As fighting broke out between Japan and Russia in 1904, public pressure was pushing the US in the direction of supporting Japan. Jewish bankers in the US helped block the Russian government from getting loans to support their war efforts, while helping the Japanese obtain loans for theirs. The Japanese would eventually decimate Russia's Far East and Baltic fleets while securing their claims in Korea, which drastically shifted the balance of power in the region. Japan's victory sent shockwaves around the world, challenging the supremacist worldview of the Europeans and giving confidence to Asians living under European subjugation. This was particularly felt in China, where the confidence of an Oriental victory against the West combined with animosity towards the anti-Chinese laws in the US began a boycott of American goods in Chinese ports. One of the reasons for targeting American goods but not European ones was because the Chinese were under the impression that the US was less likely to retaliate or enact retribution against them than the Europeans were. The boycotts escalated into anti-American protests and eventually riots where they attacked American citizens and stole, destroyed, or vandalized their properties. The Chinese government never officially sanctioned the protests, but they did little to ease tensions. Roosevelt responded to these protests by condemning the severity of the anti-Chinese laws passed in Congress and the various state legislatures. However, he would put very little political capital into actually doing anything about it. In a meeting with Chinese exclusionists, Roosevelt said, "We have one race problem on our hands and we don't want another." 5 Americans would be killed in the Chinese protests, which forced Roosevelt to beef up the US military presence in the Pacific. But these protests eventually fizzled out due to lack of cohesion amongst the various factions. Roosevelt would try to appease the Chinese government by remitting the indemnity payments imposed on China after the Boxer Rebellion, which managed to mollify them. For the Roosevelt administration, this was easier than getting Congress or the state governments to repeal anti-Chinese laws. Japan's victory over Russia has also sparked fear in the US. Despite a high demand for labor, the US was placing restrictions on Chinese immigration. Filling in this labor gap was a large number of Japanese immigrants, mostly coming into the US via Hawaii or the Philippines, where they had a large presence prior to the Spanish-American War. The influx of Japanese workers into the US surged after the Russo-Japanese War, which sparked fears amongst working-class laborers who called for restrictions on Japanese immigrations as well. Tensions would rise even higher after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The San Francisco School Board would vote to segregate their schools, sending Asian students to separate schools from white students. This angered the Japanese government, who protested the decision to President Roosevelt, not fully understanding the limited authority or influence he had over state laws. Again, TR would publicly condemn this segregation order, but he could do little to change it. Roosevelt tried to mollify the Japanese by offering a treaty in which both sides agreed to restrict workers immigrating to the other country, but this was in no way an equitable treaty, because the number of Americans seeking employment in Japan at the time was near zero, whereas the number of Japanese people seeking employment in the US was infinitely higher. And so, unsurprisingly, Japan refused this offer. The president would try again, this time getting Congress to pass a law restricting Japanese immigration from Hawaii, Canada, and Mexico. This had the effect of stopping Japanese immigration, since these areas are where most of the Japanese immigrants were coming from, while not singling out Japan for discrimination. The president would use this legislation to prevent the California legislature from passing more anti-Japanese laws of its own, as well as persuading the San Francisco School Board to rescind its segregation order. After this, Japan would agree to restrict the emigration of Japanese laborers to the US, which became known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Despite this agreement, Japanese immigration actually increased. Anti-Japanese riots broke out in California, which provoked more outrage in Japan. Newspapers in the US warned of the yellow peril, while Japanese newspapers also warned of a white peril. TR feared that Japan was gearing up for war, and pushed for Congress to appropriate more funding for the Navy, and had the Navy develop War Plan Orange, a secret plan for a potential war with Japan. And then Theodore Roosevelt, being the hunter he was, came up with an idea that would let him kill like 20 birds with one stone. He would send the US Navy on a cruise around the world, visiting various ports. This would allow the US to train seamen for longer voyages, manage supply lines, increase US prestige, and most importantly of all, show the upstart Japan that they are not the top dog in the Pacific. He would send 16 battleships, divided into 2 squadrons. It earned the nickname the Great White Fleet, thanks to the hulls being painted a bright white color. The fleet would set sail from Hampton Roads, Virginia on December 6, 1907, and hit up ports across the Caribbean and then along the east coast of South America. And since the Panama Canal wasn't finished, they had to round the Straits of Magellan and then back up the west coast to San Francisco. They would pick up additional ships as well as change commanding admirals and then set off to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. They eventually arrived in Yokohama, Japan, and by this point, the fleet had achieved its primary goal of lowering tensions with Japan, not only by showing that the US, if needed, could defeat them at sea, but also the process of arranging a foreign navy's visit made their respective diplomats more familiar with each other. From Japan, the fleet would visit Ceylon and then pass through the Suez Canal. While in Egypt, the fleet got word of an earthquake that hit Sicily, which gave them the opportunity to offer humanitarian assistance on their way through the Mediterranean. The fleet returned to Hampton Roads, Virginia on February 22, 1909, 14 months after leaving Hampton in the tension-filled days of 1907, and arriving just a month before President Roosevelt's hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, was to be inaugurated. Although the mission was successful in its intended goal of easing tensions with Japan, it also exposed several weaknesses of the US Navy. The US didn't have nearly enough bases or friendly ports that it could repair or resupply its ships in to maintain a globe-trotting navy. And despite the recent investments, the US Navy was still falling behind the Europeans, especially with the British Dreadnought-class battleships making their debut. Regardless, it was a show of force for the United States, showing the world that it was capable of all the things the other great powers were doing. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Click the top link in the description to play for free, and don't forget to use the promo code WARSHIPS to get free doubloons and a bunch of other goodies. I'd also like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Patrons get access to certain benefits, such as getting to see videos early, getting to see ad-free versions of the video, as well as getting access to a patrons-only Discord server. Find out more at patreon.com/casualhistorian. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.